Caroline's fingers trembled as she traced the outline of the faded photograph, her eyes misting over with a potent mixture of nostalgia and regret. The image captured a moment frozen in time, her younger self, radiant and carefree, standing beside Jack, his arm draped casually around her shoulders. Their smiles, so genuine and full of promise, now seemed to mock her from across the years. With a heavy sigh, she placed the photograph back into the shoebox, tucking it away beneath a pile of old letters and mementos. As she did so, her wedding ring caught the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the attic window, sending a sharp pang of guilt through her chest. How had she arrived at this point, she wondered, where the mere act of reminiscing felt like a betrayal? The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped Caroline out of her reverie. Hastily, she closed the shoebox and shoved it back onto the dusty shelf. Her husband Tom wasn't due home for hours, and their son, Ethan, was away at college. There was only one person it could be. Heart racing, Caroline descended the attic stairs and made her way to the front door. She paused for a moment, smoothing her hair and taking a deep breath to compose herself. Then, with a practiced smile, she opened the door. "Jack," she said, her voice betraying a hint of breathlessness. "You're early." He stood there, looking as handsome and magnetic as ever, a roguish grin playing at the corners of his mouth. At 45, Jack was still in his prime, his salt and pepper hair and the fine lines around his eyes only adding to his allure. Caroline felt a familiar flutter in her stomach, a sensation she both cherished and despised. "Couldn't wait to see you," Jack replied, his deep voice sending a shiver down her spine. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. In one fluid motion, he pulled Caroline into his arms, his lips finding hers with practiced ease. For a moment, Caroline allowed herself to melt into the kiss, savoring the warmth of Jack's embrace and the intoxicating scent of his cologne. But then, as always, reality came crashing back. She pulled away, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of desire and shame. "Jack, we can't keep doing this," she whispered, though her body betrayed her words as she remained in his arms. "It's not right." He chuckled softly, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. "You say that every time, Caroline, and yet here we are." She closed her eyes, fighting against the tide of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Jack was right, of course. This dance they'd been engaged in for the past 6 months was a well-rehearsed routine. The stolen moments, the passionate encounters, the subsequent guilt and promises to end it, all followed by the inevitable rekindling of their forbidden desire. Their history was complicated, to say the least. Caroline and Jack had first met 15 years ago when she was a bright-eyed graduate student, and he was her charismatic professor. The attraction had been immediate and intense, but they had resisted, knowing the impropriety of such a relationship. Instead, they had forged a deep friendship, one that had endured even after Caroline met and married Tom. For years, Caroline had convinced herself that her feelings for Jack were nothing more than a harmless crush, a what-if fantasy that she could safely indulge in the privacy of her own mind. But then, 6 months ago, everything had changed. It had started innocently enough. Jack had been going through a bitter divorce, and Caroline had offered a sympathetic ear. Late-night phone calls had turned into clandestine meetings for coffee, which had evolved into long walks in the park. And then, one rainy afternoon, as they sought shelter under a tree, Jack had kissed her. That kiss had unleashed a torrent of pent-up passion and longing that neither of them had been prepared for. In that moment, all the years of restraint and denial had crumbled, leaving them breathless and yearning for more. Now, as Caroline stood in Jack's arms in the entryway of the home she shared with her husband, she felt the familiar war raging within her. On one side was her loyalty to Tom, her commitment to their marriage, and her deep-seated belief in fidelity. On the other was the undeniable pull she felt towards Jack, a connection that seemed to transcend reason and morality. "We should talk," Caroline said, gently extricating herself from Jack's embrace. She led him into the living room, where they sat on opposite ends of the sofa, the physical distance between them a poor reflection of the emotional chasm they were both trying to navigate. Jack leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Caroline, I know this isn't easy for you. It's not easy for me either. But I can't deny my feelings for you any longer. I love you. I've loved you for years." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Caroline felt her heart constrict, torn between elation and despair. "Jack, please," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You know I care for you deeply, but I'm married. I have a son. I can't just throw all of that away." "I'm not asking you to," Jack replied, his eyes intense. "But I am asking you to consider the possibility of a life where you don't have to hide your true feelings. A life where we can be together openly, without shame or guilt." Caroline stood up abruptly, pacing the room as she tried to gather her thoughts. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to mock the darkness of her inner turmoil. She paused by the mantelpiece, her gaze falling on a family portrait. Her, Tom, and Ethan, all smiling happily at the camera. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over her. "It's not that simple, Jack," she said, turning back to face him. "Tom is a good man. He doesn't deserve this. And Ethan, how could I explain this to him? He idolizes you, you know. You're like a second father to him." Jack winced at her words, the reminder of his role in Ethan's life clearly striking a nerve. He had been a constant presence in the boy's life, a mentor and friend who had guided him through the challenges of adolescence. The thought of betraying that trust was almost as painful as the thought of losing Caroline. "I know," Jack said softly. "Believe me, I've thought about all of this. I've spent countless nights lying awake, trying to find a way out of this mess. But the truth is, Caroline, I can't imagine my life without you in it. Not anymore." Caroline felt tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted nothing more than to run into Jack's arms, to lose herself in his embrace and forget about the consequences. But she couldn't. She was a mother, a wife, a pillar of her community. She had responsibilities and obligations that she couldn't simply cast aside. "We need to end this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For real this time. It's the only way." Jack stood up, crossing the room to stand before her. He reached out, gently wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Is that really what you want?" he asked, his voice low and intense. Caroline looked up into his eyes, seeing the depth of emotion there. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a future with Jack, waking up beside him every morning, sharing their lives openly, building a new family together. The vision was so tempting, so alluring, that it made her heart ache. But then reality intruded once more. She thought of Tom, steadfast and loving, who had stood by her through thick and thin. She thought of Ethan, and how devastated he would be to see his family torn apart. And she thought of herself, the woman she had always strived to be, honest and true to her commitments. "What I want," Caroline said slowly, "is to be the kind of person I can be proud of. The kind of person my son can look up to." Jack's hand fell away from her face, and she saw the pain of rejection flash in his eyes. But there was also understanding there, and a grudging respect for her decision. "I understand," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I won't pretend it doesn't hurt, but I understand." They stood there for a long moment, the air between them charged with unspoken words and unfulfilled desires. Then, with a sad smile, Jack turned and walked towards the door. As his hand reached for the doorknob, Caroline felt a sudden panic grip her. "Jack, wait!" she called out, her voice trembling. He paused, turning back to look at her with a mixture of hope and resignation. Caroline took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to say. "I need you to know. I love you too. I always have, and I probably always will. But sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes we have to make the hard choices, even when they break our hearts." Jack nodded, a bittersweet smile playing at his lips. "I know," he said softly. "That's one of the things I've always loved about you, Caroline. Your strength, your integrity, even when it costs you everything." With that, he opened the door and stepped out into the fading afternoon light. Caroline watched him go, her heart breaking anew with each step he took away from her. As the door closed behind Jack, Caroline sank to the floor, her back against the wall, and allowed herself to cry. She cried for the love she was losing, for the pain she had caused, and for the future she would never know. Hours passed, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, Caroline finally stirred from her spot on the floor. She felt drained, both emotionally and physically, but there was also a sense of resolution settling over her. She had made her choice, difficult as it was, and now she had to live with it. She made her way to the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face and studying her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying, but there was a determination in them that hadn't been there before. She would get through this, she told herself. She would find a way to move forward. The sound of a key in the lock startled her. Tom was home. Taking a deep breath, Caroline steeled herself for what she knew she had to do. As she walked down the stairs, she saw Tom hanging up his coat in the entryway. He looked up at her approach, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Hey, honey," he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. "Everything okay? You look like you've been crying." Caroline took his hand, leading him to the living room couch. "We need to talk, Tom," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "There's something I need to tell you." Tom's expression grew serious as he sat down beside her. "What is it, Caroline? You're scaring me." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I've done something terrible," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I'm deeply ashamed of, and something that might change everything between us." As the words began to pour out of her, Caroline felt a strange mix of dread and relief. She told Tom everything about her long-standing feelings for Jack, about the affair that had begun 6 months ago, and about her decision to end it once and for all. Tom listened in stunned silence, his face a mask of shock and pain. When Caroline finally finished speaking, the silence that fell between them was deafening. "I don't know what to say," Tom said at last, his voice hoarse with emotion. I never imagined you could do something like this, Caroline." "I'm so sorry, Tom," Caroline whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I am truly, deeply sorry. I love you, and I love our family. I made a terrible mistake, and I'm prepared to face the consequences." Tom stood up abruptly, pacing the room as he had so often seen Caroline do. She watched him, her heart breaking anew at the pain she had caused this good man. "I need time," Tom said finally, turning to face her. "I need time to process all of this. I can't be here right now." Caroline nodded, understanding. "Of course," she said softly. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready to talk." Tom nodded curtly, then turned and walked out of the room. A few moments later, Caroline heard the front door open and close, followed by the sound of his car starting up and driving away. Left alone once more, Caroline felt the full weight of her actions crashing down upon her. She had made her choice, to be honest, to try and salvage her marriage, but the cost of that choice was only now becoming clear. As the night wore on, Caroline remained on the couch, replaying the events of the day in her mind. She thought of Jack, wondering where he was and how he was coping with their final goodbye. She thought of Tom, out there somewhere, grappling with the betrayal of his wife. And she thought of Ethan, blissfully unaware of the turmoil that awaited him when he returned home. In the darkest hours of the night, Caroline found herself questioning everything. Had she made the right choice? Would her marriage survive this betrayal? Could she ever regain Tom's trust or Jack's friendship? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswerable and relentless. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the windows, Caroline stirred from her vigil. She felt drained and hollow, but also strangely calm. The storm of emotions that had been raging within her for months seemed to have finally passed, leaving in its wake a quiet determination. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if Tom would forgive her, or if she would ever truly get over Jack. But she did know one thing. She had taken the first step towards reclaiming her integrity, towards becoming the person she wanted to be. Caroline stood up, stretching her stiff muscles, and made her way to the kitchen. As she brewed a pot of coffee, she found herself thinking of the long road ahead. There would be difficult conversations, painful revelations, and undoubtedly more tears to come. But for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. She had made her choice, and now she would live with it. She would fight for her marriage, if Tom was willing. She would be honest with Ethan, painful as it might be. And she would find a way to move forward, carrying the lessons of this experience with her. As she sipped her coffee, watching the sun rise over the neighborhood she called home, Caroline made a silent promise to herself. No matter what happened, no matter how difficult things got, she would face the future with honesty and courage. It was the only way she could hope to rebuild what she had nearly destroyed. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Caroline was ready to walk it. One step at a time, one day at a time, she would find her way back to the woman she wanted to be, a woman of integrity, a woman worthy of love and trust. As she heard a car pull into the driveway, Tom returning home, Caroline took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. Whatever came next, she would face it head on. It was time to begin the hard work of healing, of rebuilding, of moving forward. With one last look at the rising sun, Caroline turned away from the window and walked towards the front door, towards Tom, towards their future, whatever it might hold. The first step on a new journey, one that she hoped would lead her back to the path of honesty and love. As she opened the door to face Tom, Caroline felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to walk it, ready to face the consequences of her actions, ready to fight for her marriage if Tom would have her, ready to become the person she knew she could be. In that moment, standing on the threshold between her past and her future, Caroline realized that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that lead us back to ourselves. And as she looked into Tom's tired, hurt eyes, she knew that whatever happened next, she had taken the first step towards redemption. The story of Caroline and Jack, of love and betrayal, of choices and consequences, had come to an end. But Caroline's story, her journey of self-discovery, of redemption, of rebuilding trust, was only just beginning. And as she invited Tom inside, ready to face whatever came next, she knew that this new chapter, though difficult, held the promise of a deeper, more authentic life. In the end, that was all she could ask for, the chance to learn from her mistakes, to grow, and to become the person she had always aspired to be. As the door closed behind them, Caroline and Tom embarking on the painful but necessary conversation that lay ahead, the first light of a new day spilled across the threshold, symbolic of the hope that still remained, even in the aftermath of betrayal and heartbreak.